Yes, also good morning from my side. A very warm welcome. My name is Carola Richter. I'm a professor for international communication at Freie Universität Berlin, and I'm very glad to facilitate the two morning sessions. Since we're running a bit late, I will hurry up a little bit, and we will have now two keynotes that give us a little bit of an idea about the theoretical framework and hopefully also some empirical foundations on what trust in the context of media usage is actually. Because we heard now so many phrases related to trust. We talked about, or we heard something about credibility, disinformation, fake news, and all these kind of things. So I guess we're eager to hear more about what we are actually talking about when we're talking about trust. So we would have had 90 minutes in total, but this is a little bit, that has a little bit decreased. But we asked each of the two speakers to have 20 minutes. And after the first keynote, we will have a break for you to raise questions and comment on what has been said. And you can, of course, have the questions here in the room, but we will also invite our online community to write questions or short comments in the chat. And we have here Mira Schweders, who will take care of this and read it out. And I hope we will have a very engaged discussion in this first panel. So our first distinguished speaker is today, she is Nicole Stremlow. And Nicole is a senior research fellow and head of the program in comparative media law and policy at the Center for Socio-Legal Studies at Oxford University. At the same time, she's also a research professor in the humanities at the University of Johannesburg. Furthermore, she currently has a leading position in a large ERC project on the politics and practice of social media and conflicts. And the project, it is called ConflictNet. And in this project, she analyzes the uses and impact of social media on societies of conflict-affected areas, mostly in Eastern Africa. And besides this, Nicole's research focuses also on the role of media in peace building and consolidation of political power and media law and regulation in fragile contexts, in particular in Africa. So Nicole, the floor is yours. We are happy to have you here and give us some insights on your understanding of trust.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm joining you today from Johannesburg, where I am. I'm going to Oxford next week, actually, but I'm here doing some research on social media and migration. So it's really a pleasure that I can connect with you from so far away. So today I really want to try and take a step back. So I'd like to speak about trust on 3 levels that are related to online speech and offline violence. And I'll draw on some of our current research in this area. So the first area is trust in the idea of social media companies to do the right thing. The second area is trust in those that intervene or attempt to intervene, including media development organizations, which I know there's a lot together in the room today, to really understand what is actually going on and to base their interventions on evidence. And the third area is understanding how communities trust information that they receive in very different places from very different actors and on very different mediums. And I understand you'll be speaking a lot about number 3 over the course of the day, but I just wanted to try and tie these areas together. So I'm sure that many people have been following the recently published Facebook files and the associated parliamentary and Senate testimony of Frances Haugen. So I personally, as someone, a lot of my work has been on the continent in Africa, I was really struck by how many times she mentioned the ongoing conflict in Ethiopia. And I was surprised because Ethiopia is always very much peripheral to business interests and particularly the interests of large social media companies. But Haugen had very strong words. So she was arguing that what we see in Myanmar and we're now seeing in Ethiopia are only the opening chapters of a story that's so terrifying. No one wants to read the end of it. She accused Facebook of literally, quote, literally fanning ethnic violence. These are very strong words, and she was drawing strong parallels between Ethiopia and Myanmar. And we know in Myanmar, for example, the UN fact-finding mission there found that social media was in fact seen to have a determining role in suspected genocide in the country. So the question is what now, if we have this evidence that we think we have, what do we do about it? Much of what has been made public in the files is information that was already known or suspected by many actors, although it's often been countered or denied by social media companies. But these files reaffirmed and confirmed the severity of the deep inequalities in terms of how social media content is being regulated. We now have more evidence, for example, that online hate speech in most countries in the global south is not being taken down. It's not being monitored. Facebook had previously argued that they'd proactively removed 90% or so of identified hate speech. But these internal leaked records show us that actually it's as little as 3 to 5% of the speech is removed. And I think this number is even likely to be less for countries such as Ethiopia and Somalia. So it's long been known that social media companies have not invested in human moderation equally. More than 90% of their users are outside of North America, but only a small percentage of these moderators focus on the global south. And the Facebook files also revealed, again, in the case of Ethiopia, that they were only they only had language competency in 2 out of more than 50 languages. In AI, I think, which is a lot of companies have really been hoping that artificial intelligence is going to be the solution. These files also revealed that it's not going to be the solution for a long time. Not only does it seem to lack the required sensitivity to very complex situations, but again, the files indicated that Facebook's algorithms, for example, incorrectly deleted Arabic language content more than 70% of the time. So given that languages such as Amharic, Swahili, Somali are even less prevalent and are also considered to be low resource languages, where there's less material online for AI to be trained on, accurate and automated content removal for these languages is even further off. So I think what is going on in terms of online hate speech in the global south raises very big and important questions about trust. So what the Facebook files do show, I think, is that we can't trust large social media companies to get it right or even prioritize getting it right in countries that are not within their sort of main financial emphasis at the moment, financial priorities. So in response to Haugen's leaks, that the system has been constructed in such a way that it amplifies division, extremism, polarization, the undermining of societies, and in some cases actually leading to actual violence, Zuckerberg argued that his platform has been addressing these concerns through removing content and building, quote, unprecedented third-party fact-checking programs. And I think this has sort of an interesting parallel with what Anya was talking about, the need to really interrogate also the ability of community media, for example, to really be the most trusted resource just because it's the most local one. And so, for example, we've been doing some research into what many of these third-party fact-checking programs in Africa are trying to do and understand when hate speech is flagged. And what is emerging from some of our work, and we've been interviewing a wide number of them across the continent, is that they're not up to scale. And in some cases, they only refute a few pieces of content and misinformation a month. And they do precisely that. They focus on misinformation, they focus on disinformation, not the takedown of hate speech, not the takedown of that kind of content that might lead to violence. So fact-checking organizations can do important work. I'm not trying to dismiss the very hard work that they're doing, but their reach is very limited. And they also emerged in another period during another phase. They're really geared towards fact-checking mass media, political content, not the sort of messy, enormous online spaces that we're dealing with on social media. And most of these organizations also don't have the proper language competencies, and neither does Facebook's automated third-party fact-checking operations that sort of that send the content to these organizations to be fact-checked. So moving to the second area of trust, I think it's clear that online hate speech, particularly in conflict situations, is prevalent and a major problem on social media. But how do those that intervene or want to intervene, understand what's going on. And I think this is a relevant question for many of you in the room that are working in the media development space. So what evidence do you trust? And it's also very relevant for us as academics in terms of how we think about what evidence we trust in terms of trying to understand the connection between online speech and offline violence. And I think one thing that we're also seeing, and that has been very much amplified from the Haugen leaks, is there's this sort of notion, and again, Anya mentioned it in her introductory remarks, but there's this notion that there's something extreme or particular about social media, that these false media messages are causing this irrational behavior. And there's sort of this panic going on right now. And I think judging from how academics, how the news media is speaking of misinformation and this intense power of media to alter elections, to start wars, we seem to be in this period, this time when social media is all powerful. And I also see this in academia, where I see a lot of my colleagues that are working on social media in elections and the influence and effects of social media. There's a big emphasis on big data right now, social network analysis, computational propaganda. And there's this focus on coming up with models or approaches about the overwhelming influence on social media on society. But the question is what these types of methods and tools, and what this turn to these types of methods and tools is making visible, and what they're making less visible. So I almost think that we need to return to the ground, to the field. And I think, again, in many respects, this is what media development experts are also excel in, the deep field work, the deep groundwork at the community level. And as part of our quest, as part of the Conflict Nets project that we've been working on, we've also been trying to understand the academic literature and the empirical evidence that's undergrounding these sort of assumptions about social media, online speech, and offline violence. And so we've been doing a semi-structured evidence review, which is based on the UK DFID, or used to be DFID's, guidance about how to assess the strength of evidence. So we've tried to be very, very systematic about it and investigate and interrogate the link between online speech and offline harms across a variety of disciplines, from information science to psychology, various methodologies. We focused on the last 10 years, and we also focused on Africa, which really helped to narrow down our search. So we came up with a database search that had more than 25,000 texts. But when we interrogated them and really looked for strong empirical evidence, it was down to around a dozen or so publications that we felt were really probing this in depth and had strong evidence. But almost all of the articles in our scope really were grounded on one shared premise: that ICTs exert this great and increasing influence on African societies. Oftentimes, the text was sort of situated within the context of the potential benefits ICTs will bring for development, but more commonly, communication technologies were ascribed with considerable influence in the political context. It was often positive, although I think the trends in that are changing, but it was in facilitating the dissemination of political information, encouraging democratic participation, and also as catalysts for collective action and unrest. But the mechanism which translates between technology and violence, however, was very unclear. And one thing that really emerged was how under-researched this is. So in short, we actually found very little evidence really clearly identifying this link. And I think this type of panic and assumptions is not necessarily isolated to media scholars, in which case I return to my earlier example of the case of Ethiopia. And I think it's important, as we really start to, I say we, but as attention really starts to focus on Ethiopia and the concerns of online hate speech and offline violence, to really try and ground ourselves in what is happening. And here the Journal of Genocide Research recently published an interesting special issue, which was on trying to situate Ethiopia within sort of these larger genocide debates. And the article opened in the beginning, the sort of introductory article was saying that genocide scholars for a long time have largely neglected Ethiopia's histories and histories of atrocious violence, but this appears set to change. So there's a growing interest in Ethiopia now. And what implications does this have? and they sort of traced this growing media interest of scholars and practitioners that, worked in Rwanda in 1994, then moved to Darfur, and now there's this growing attention and growing sort of re-emphasis with similar ideas and similar trends on Ethiopia. So as Ethiopia moves into the headlines, there is the very serious risk of distorting or politicizing basic concepts or research questions. And I think here as academics, we're also able to be plagued by the same problems that human rights activists or media support activists have as well. And we're also very prone to getting it wrong, prone to proposing theories that only make sense from a distance, prone to jumping to assumptions. And certainly hate speech in contemporary Ethiopia has been pervasive, both online and offline, from all angles, the diaspora, the government, soldiers, and others. In a now notorious speech just a few months ago, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed called on Ethiopians to get rid of the cancer of the TPLF, to remove the weed. And in our country, he said, he explained that they weed collectively. And I think this sort of language really shocked people. It really shocked international governments as well. And an ally of the prime minister also said that Tigrayans should be erased and disappeared from historical records. And the only way one should find about them is by digging in the graves. And I think this language coming from a government, and I think this kind of language is very pervasive on social media and coming from other actors, but coming from the government, it really shocked people. Particularly when you put that alongside some of the actions that have been taken against Tigrayans in recent months. And there's certainly echoes in Rwanda. And I think indeed many headlines we see have been drawing this comparison. Headlines like, Africa can prevent Ethiopia from going down Rwanda's path, or will Ethiopia's genocide be worse than Rwanda? And hate speech, again, is closely tied in with this and associated with it. But what are the real implications of this? And how do we avoid the types of assumptions that colleagues have warned us about in terms of distorting, politicizing, or getting things wrong? And so in essence, this is my third and my final point is, how can we better understand media effects in these different contexts, particularly when we're operating on very or relatively short timeframes, although as the Journal of Genocide Research certainly highlighted the rich sort of history of tracing these episodes and the rich literature that has been published on previous extreme episodes of extreme violence in Ethiopia. But I think rather than offering a path for Ethiopia, as much of the headlines on Rwanda have suggested, Rwanda is also a warning for those, I think, those researchers and those that are working in media development. So as I'm sure everyone in the room knows or online knows, Radio Mille is held up as the prime example of when media leads to mass violence. And of course, propaganda has long been implicated or seen as having a central role in wars. But Rwanda is seen, I think, as one of the first times when the so-called international community was supposed to have done something about it. So they were supposed to have jammed the transmitters, taken it offline. They were too slow to act on an information intervention as a possible way of stemming the violence. And much of the early academic research has certainly supported this relationship between hate radio and violence. But a decade later, we've also seen a change in some of the research. We've seen a change in some of the evidence. So Scott Strauss, for example, did a very interesting study refuting the conventional wisdom that broadcasts from the radio were actually predominantly our primary determinant of the genocide. So he found much more conditional effects, which only had significance when situated in this broader context of violence and the broader information ecology. So he noted, similarly to as we did in our evidence review, that there's been little sustained social scientific analysis of radio media effects in the Rwandan genocide. And much of the writing has very much asserted or implied undifferentiated, direct, and massive effects in a way that's odd with what we know about sort of broader, more longitudinal political communications empirical research. And through dozens of interviews with individuals involved with the violence, as well as through tracking radio broadcasts and outbreaks of violence, he argues that radio alone certainly doesn't account for either the onset of the most genocidal violence or the participation of most perpetrators. I mean, he certainly found some evidence that radio catalyzed a small number of individuals and incidents of violence, framed public choice, and also reinforced messages that some individuals were receiving through other means. But I think one of the challenges is right now, again, we're seeing some of this research on social media and violence repeat itself from the earlier research on radio and violence in Africa, which is being driven by these simplistic models of behavior that also tend to attribute little or no agency to the communities or the individuals involved. And they also minimize the contexts in which the extreme violence takes place, like the special issue of genocide research. As I said, it's not focusing on Ethiopia. So it's not just media scholars. It's also can apply to a lot of there's a lot of challenges when a lot of people move to investigate and act on, the latest crisis. And I think we also see this greater trend, at least in the UK and elsewhere, of more emphasis on humanitarian crises and humanitarian challenges rather than sort of more long-term development assistance. So I think one of the big challenges of understanding the connection between social media and violence, and here again, take the case of Ethiopia, is trying to identify and understand the shifting context of information. And again, coming back to this concept of trust that we're talking about, which varies significantly, not only between countries, but also within communities. So considering contemporary events in Ethiopia can also today, with the ongoing conflict, it can be very helpful to reflect on Ethiopia's notorious 2005 elections that was also associated with extreme violence. And there, social media did not have as much of a role, but mass media was seen as significant in some communities, but not in the way one might have expected. So there, the ruling party, the EPRDF, provided unprecedented open coverage through the state media. So outlets were particularly generous in their coverage of the opposition for the first time. And the impact of providing opposition groups with increased access to the media was more significant than predicted, particularly in rural areas. So the private media was free and relatively open in urban areas. Residents were used to it. The airing of opposition views and political debates on radio in rural communities challenged expectations and perceptions of the government, perceptions of who was in charge. So it wasn't so much the content or the substance of the debate that affected how people voted, but it was really the fact that the government was seen as so weak that now it has to sit with its enemies and it has to broadcast the opposition on, it has to give the opposition space on government radio. And so some of these communities, and so I'm also citing the work of an anthropologist, René Lafort, who was working in the Amhara communities. He thought that these communities saw this as a signal that the government was so weak that it had to sit with its enemies and future power would be taken over by the opposition. And so this demanded the support and the allegiance of the farmer, and they wanted to be on the right side of history. And so that affected how they voted in the end. So it wasn't so much the content, but the actual opening of this space. And I think if you contrast this with neighboring Somalia or the Somali territories, which also overlap and are part of Eastern Ethiopia, Somalia is seen as the world's worst failed state. It's seen as a place where nothing works. It's seen as having no media freedom. But actually newspapers are flourishing there. Radio flourishes, warlord radio flourishes. Somalia also has the 10th lowest data prices in the world. And with this has been a very vibrant online community, including what Somalis have argued, an abundance of mass media and online hate speech. And this raises very important questions that contrast, and again, I say the Somali community is part of Ethiopia, but this contrasts very much with what was described in Ethiopia. For a region that has been subjected to longstanding violence, where media has been an integral part of it, with warlords establishing radios for the last 25 years and media being woven into the fabric of the conflict, how does one think about or understand online hate speech or incitement to violence in this kind of context? So I realize my 20 minutes is up. So I conclude, unfortunately, with not having many answers as questions. But I think these questions of trust and the potential of harmful content in the global South are in countries that are of less priority for companies that are operating there, urgently requires more research on understanding the very diverse context and the agency as well of those on the ground, on interpreting, evaluating, and how or whether or not they trust certain content on social media coming from different actors, from various actors at various times is something that I hope will add sort of an alternative perspective to the perspective and the discussions that we'll be having over the next couple of days from media development sectors. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicole. Thank you very much, Nicole, for this impressive talk. And we will have time for questions and comments and hopefully some answers also from your side. So anyone who wants to raise a question, please indicate that and raise your hand, and we will have a microphone ready for that here. And of course, also the online audience is invited to raise the questions. Meanwhile, maybe I would take the time to ask one first question to you. And I would like to take you on your last point that you mentioned, and you already indicated that there was some, well, there is online hate speech, or there is hate speech being distributed via social media, and you nicely laid out how much this has taken place in various countries. But you also mentioned that, well, we had this kind of hate speech before with so-called traditional media now, right? So radio in particular, in the East African region. And this morning we had a speaker here who made a distinction between social media, where online or where hate speech is so much spread and where you have so much disinformation and fake news, versus traditional media, where you could really kind of believe into that there is truth being spread. And I don't really think that this matches with cases in the global south which we deal with. But what do you think? Is there a kind of a special quality to be attributed to social media when it comes to the spreading of online hate speech? So is there a difference that can be attributed to social media in relation to also traditional media?
Thank you. I think that is really the golden question. So I don't know. That's the challenge. I think a lot of organizations like Cambridge Analytica would argue, yes, exactly. You know, they're able to harvest large amounts of data from users online and target messages directly at them. You know, is this in Cambridge Analytica started, you know, it perfected its trade in Kenya and Nigeria before moving to the United States. So again, I think this is one reason why, looking at what I think in many cases Africa is really at the forefront in addressing and also being a space where many of these tools are tried out before they're used in other markets as conflict situations as well. So I think one of the challenges and also addressing that is, I think, social media. So mass media is always involved a whole host of international actors as well. So it's been media support organizations. It's also been, you know, I think if you look at the history of conflict on the continent, there's always been guerrilla insurgency radio stations. So a lot of liberation actors in the 60s, 70s, 80s had their own radio. They had printing presses in caves, in some cases, in the case of Ethiopia, or they had magazines that were being published in London. So there's always been international dimensions to the mass media as well. But I think one of the things that has changed is the extent to which also the diaspora has been getting involved with social media. And so we did a study with Addis Ababa University on online hate speech. It was now around the previous election, so it was about 5 years ago. So the situation was very different then. But we were struck by a couple of things. And one of them was the extent to which the hate speech, and again, this is also coming out in the current conflict, has been coming from the diaspora. So we actually found Norway was the country that had the highest levels of online hate speech targeting Ethiopia. We didn't probe further what was distinct about Norway or the community in Norway that was leading that. We also found a lot of online hate speech on spaces that you might not necessarily expect. So a lot of it was on like sports pages, for example, rather than the pages of political parties. Again, the situation then was extremely different than it is now. But I think that sort of highlights some of the challenges that we face when looking at online hate speech on social media, and also the issues of taking it down versus mass media. And I think one of the questions that I also raised and I discussed with Anya in the past as well is, what does one do about this? And I think one challenge between dealing with mass media and dealing with online social media is that just after the genocide in Rwanda and during the conflict in Bosnia, there was a move to really think about information interventions. So in Rwanda, the US, other governments really hesitated on this idea of jamming the transmitters, and then they realized maybe we made a mistake, maybe that should have been done. So in Bosnia, people were much more aggressive in terms of taking out mass media. I think with social media, the debate has flattened in terms of, well, the social media companies aren't necessarily regulating their hateful content online. Who can do it? And I think that's one reason why we see this also rise of internet shutdowns on the continent, is that some governments are claiming this media is not being regulated. We have a lot of misinformation during election period. We have a lot of online hate speech during conflict. And so the only tools that we really have available are to shut down the internet. I think that there is definitely a conversation that has to happen in terms of what other tools are available or what other actors are there that could intervene in the situation of extreme violence or genocide, in terms of addressing the concerns about what impact social media might be having on it.
Okay. This might definitely stimulate the discussion among the media assistance organizations. Any other questions here from the audience? Okay, is there one? Otherwise, is there a question or some questions from the online community? So please, Mira, read it out.
Yes, thank you. So there's a question by Terje Skjerdal. She's asking or saying that there's a difference between Ethiopia and Rwanda. And she's asking you, Nicole, do you see, so in Ethiopia, it was social media, and in Rwanda, legacy media? And do you see elements of the legacy media in Ethiopia today being used in a similar way or it was used in Rwanda in the 90s?
That's a really good question. And so I have to say, I think we should probably unmute Terje and he can answer this, because he's also been doing extraordinary research on the media in Ethiopia. So this is really his question to answer, I think. To be honest, I've really been focusing on the online media in Ethiopia. So I think what we saw and it also as Terje has written about a lot as well, in terms of the media after when the EPRDF first came to power. I mean, the media has been extremely polarized in Ethiopia, but it's also had much more limited reach. So there weren't private radio stations for a long time. So it was mostly independent newspapers, but they had a very small area of dispersion. So it was mostly in the capitals of Addis Ababa. And so I think that's one factor that was a major difference in terms of the reach of these outlets. I don't know if Terje wants to come in.
Yeah, okay.
If you can.
Any other questions? Yes, we have one here in the audience.
Hi, I came a bit late, so I haven't followed everything, but from what I've heard, I just wanted to get your perspective that you mentioned the conflict at the moment and the hate speech coming from the diaspora community, which in fact at the moment, the most hate speech is coming from the government officials, from the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, which is perpetuated and propagated and also targeting an ethnic group, which is fueling the conflict at the moment. How do you see this? Also from the perspective of shutting down the internet, what's in the ground in Ethiopia is people thinking of social media as an internet as a social media, because we have a low literacy in media. So there is the problem and the challenge of any citizen in Ethiopia, ordinary person, not distinguishing what internet is and also what social media is. What they see in the social media, they take it as a fact and as a truth. So when some high officials or government saying a certain group is this and perpetuating hate speech, they take it as the fact and as a truth. And how do you see this? And also through our work in mitigating hate speech, we have informed the tech companies. We have challenged the tech companies to take responsibility and accountability for what's happening on the ground. What's been disseminated online is impacting a lot of civilians offline. So there is the aspect of tech companies not care, basically they don't really care of what's happening in many African countries, even though we keep informing them, like the content moderation, for example. Some of us do it voluntarily because we would like to minimize the harm in the society. But then there is this aspect of the tech companies, the multi-billion tech companies, not investing on moderating the content, failing the social media hate speech dissemination, like failing the people, and also the dissemination of the social media, the dissemination of hate speech and violence inciting speech on social media. Mm-hmm. How do you see this from the perspective of the tech companies as well?
Thank you. Nicole?
You know, thank you for that. That's a lot of questions in there, but I think you raised excellent points on all of them. So I'm not sure if you were in the audience when I was speaking earlier about the issue of, so I was quoting some of what Abiy Ahmed had said in some of his political speeches in terms of hate speech. And so I think absolutely, this is certainly a huge issue. And I think it's different than in the past when you have extreme speech that's coming from individuals in the government. In terms of the hate speech that from the diaspora, I was referring to to a study that we did, which is published and it's publicly available. It's called Mechachal with Addis Ababa University, and it was looking at online hate speech around the previous election, so 2015. So it wasn't right now, it wasn't during this conflict. And that's when we found a lot of the hate speech or dangerous speech or speech going against, and actually there was quite a lot of speech against Tigrayans as well. At the time, it was the EPRDF, there was Tigrayan leadership, but it was, we did find a lot of hate speech against Tigrayans even at that period of time, which made the study a bit complicated in its own right, because it's one thing when it's hate speech against the government in power, and it's another thing when it's hate speech against communities that are much less powerful. And I've also been following some of the work of some of these groups, and I think again a lot of them are diaspora-led, diaspora influenced in terms of trying to take down some of the content. I've spoken with some colleagues as well that have been involved in this, and maybe you're working together on it, and about the responses that they've been getting from the social media companies. And in some cases, the social media companies have actually asked them to come back and translate something from Amharic into English. And so I think there's very, very real concerns. I think that was very much highlighted in the Facebook files in terms of the lack of resources that have been devoted to countries in the global south when it comes to online content moderation. I'm still still, I think this is my concern with the question of what to do, because I think, as I said in the beginning, I think effective online content moderation in very diverse societies, particularly in Africa, is a long way off. It's not coming tomorrow. And so the question is what do you do between point A and B over the next however many years it's going to take to get there? So I think companies are trying to argue that they're going to have AI. AI is the way forward. AI in English or French is very different than AI on Amharic or Somali. It just hasn't been, it hasn't even, they're not using it right now, as far as I understand. So, and I think we also see that in the third-party fact-checking organizations, which Facebook says that it's relying on in terms of addressing much of this content on the continent, where they're mostly getting, I asked some organizations in Kenya and elsewhere, for example, what languages do you receive the content in? Do you receive it in Somali? Do you receive it in Swahili? What languages are you getting it in? What about mixtures of languages? Not everyone, it's sometimes people write in slang on social media as well. And it seems as though it's largely coming in, in English or in French. So I think that it's a very, very big challenge in this question of, I don't see, your sort of third question was about governments shutting down social media. I think this is a very big area of discussion in terms of who intervenes and what do you do now. And I think now I say we as in people that are thinking about media development or academic research in this area, I think with the evidence that has emerged from the Facebook files, about these inequalities in content moderation, the question has become even more urgent. And I think we can look back at some of the tools that people were discussing when it comes to mass media in intervening. I don't think taking the entire internet offline is a question, but I think we should be having provocative discussions about what responsibilities companies have about having their product easily accessible in countries when they're not providing sufficient content moderation for it.
Okay, thank you very much, Nicole. Is there any last pressing question from the audience? Okay, so in light of time constraints, maybe we can say thank you, Nicole, for this very interesting talk and your interventions here. I think we can give her a great applause. Thank you.